Chris Rempel is a Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde tribal member and works for the tribe as a cultural educational specialist. His team shares and teaches about the life ways and cultures of the tribe to both the tribal community and the general public. He also works with various federal agencies in surveying and protecting cultural significant locations and the first food populations. Milwaukee Museum is honored today to have Chris as our guest. As you heard Adam speak of the importance of telling other cultures' importance, it has been Milwaukee's museum mission to reach out to those whose cultural heritage is seldom addressed. Chris, I cannot begin to say thank you enough for being here and spreading your knowledge about your ancestry and your homelands. After he's done with his original presentation, we'll be taking questions and answers from the audience, and also if you're viewing today on Zoom. If you have a question at the end of his presentation, raise your hand if you're in the audience. If you are on Zoom, please use the chat feature and Nicole will read it on off. So please, without any hesitation, everybody's done listening to me, here is Chris Rempel.
Right. Shlahayim Kanaway Telekom, Naganim Chris Rempel. Hi everybody, my name is Chris Rempel. My people are the Kalapuya, Chinook, Klamath, also German, Chinese, and Hawaiian. And it's a traditional thing, especially coming in tribal communities, introducing who you are, not only your tribes, but also your families, because that establishes your kinship, how you're related to each other. Especially here in the Northwest, intermarriage between tribes and bands was very common. So that's something I always like to start with and explain it a bit. It's also very, very relevant. Digging a little deeper on Mary's River, Kalapuya, so that's near the Corvallis area. Lower Chinook, which is closer towards the mouth of the Columbia, kind of Scappoose area. And then I've also got various other tribes as well that would take so long to name, but just because it's relevant, I'm also Rogue River family there, and a lot of those people were moved to the Siletz Reservation, as I mentioned, Klamath. I'm also part Iroquois, because with the Hudson's Bay Company coming down here, one of their interpreter trappers was an Iroquois man who came and married into the tribe, and a large section of our tribe actually has descendancy from that man, Louis Changretta. And so I really wanted to start with that somewhat long introduction because it's a really important place to start when talking about the tribes in this area. As you know, it's called the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. That's because we weren't a monolithic tribe. There were over 23 different bands and tribes that were all grouped together. We didn't share the same culture, the same language. In fact, some of these tribes were enemies. But after the treaty period, they were removed to the reservations and forced to live together. And so starting with that is just kind of a basic knowledge, and then digging deeper kind of into where we are now, the Clackamas Chinook, the people of this area. As I mentioned, I'm not Clackamas Chinook, but my mentor, Greg Archuleta, is. He's a descendancy of Wachino, one of the original chiefs of the area in this place. And so I think the best way to start is a video he made talking about his connection and the importance of this place, and specifically Willamette Falls. So we'll start with a short video in his words to kind of set the stage.
For countless generations, my people, the Willamette Tumwater and Clackamas Chinook, have lived here at Tumwater, today known as Willamette Falls. The falls are within our traditional homelands, and today we continue to maintain our connection to the falls. We are people of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. In the wintertime, the ancient stories are told. We call them Ikani in the Kitch, or the Chinook language, and Ikanam in Chinook Wawa. The people are in the plank houses when the economy are shared. Now Coyote was going along. Now he liked this place. Now he built the falls there. Now they say he tied it down with rope made from hazel shoots. Now the falls are ready. Now he built a fish trap there. Now it became full of salmon, that trap. Now he insulted that fish trap. Now that fish trap worked no longer. Now we must dip net and spear our fish at the falls. Ikani, Ikani, story, story. Here at the Tumwater, fishing was premier. It was a major trade center, and the Willamette, Tumwater, and Clackamas hosted many tribes who visited. It was like this for countless generations. Our people were relocated to the Grand Ronde Reservation under treaty in 1855, but we continued to return to the falls for fishing of salmon, steelhead, and skockwal, the eel. I myself am a direct descendant of the Thais, our chiefs, Oregon City John of the Willamette Tumwater on one side of the family, and Tai Wachino of the Clackamas Chook on the other side. Within 100 years, the federal government decided to sever the relationship with the tribe under the Western Oregon Termination Act. This resulted in the closing of the reservation. My grandmother, the granddaughter of Oregon City John, decided to write just a memorandum. It detailed the many families at Grand Ronde and told the story of our family and the connection to Tumwater. She recounted how our family village site was on the west side of the falls. She wanted her descendants to always know who they were and where they came from. Our tribes were terminated for almost 30 years, but in 1983 regained federal recognition. We are alive. We maintain our ties to the Tumwater. We gather here for ceremony to honor the first salmon as they ascend the river. We gather the skockwal. Our canoes are on the river, and we sing our songs to honor the land, our ancestors, elders, and our families, including the water, animal, and plant beings. Our youth are part of ceremony. They will know to maintain our connection to the falls and our tribal ways.
Yeah, and so always, appreciate just that video from Greg, my mentor, to start that off. As I said, I don't know everything, but I've been entrusted by Greg and the tribe to kind of speak and share what I do know here today. And so speaking about the daily life of the Clackamas Chinook, the first thing I think of is this term we have called lifeways. And it's fairly self-defined. It's just the way of living. It goes beyond culture. Culture at times can seem performative. It can be like the surface level of what the ceremonies, songs, dances, food are. But Lifeways tries to get a little deeper of like, what are your relationships? What are your teachings and how you live with the land, with each other, and remember these things. And so we use the term Lifeways a lot in our tribe to talk about that. And one of the core things that really relates to day-to-day life is the seasonal round. Living on the land here, being in a relationship with the land, like, as you know, and farmers know, like, what's in stock that season, what's growing that season, like, determines how you live, what you do that day. And so day-to-day life, if this was 2,000 years ago, fall time, our seasonal round right now would be the fall runs of fish are coming up the rivers now. So you've got the late salmon, you've got the winter steelhead starting to make their way up, and then you've got the berries are finished, but right coming up now would be tarweed. So traditionally, a lot of these areas, in addition to the oak savannas, you'd have open fields of tarweed, which is related to the sunflower plant. And it's called tarweed because it smells like tar. If you feel the leaves, it's sticky, and if you smell it, it smells like tar. And a lot of the farmers in the area really disliked it because it would get on their livestock and really get their fur all matted up. But that was a major food for this time of year. And similar to sunflower seeds, you eat the seeds. And so what we'd do is we'd burn the fields around this time of year, late September, and they'd start to char those seeds in the husks, and then you'd come and gather them in a basket up to eat them. And so that's what would be happening this time of year. At the same time, it's acorn season. So I'm sure there's lots of oak trees around here. I know there's a lot in this area now and also traditionally. And acorns were the other major food that's coming this time of year. And so you probably see them, acorns come in massed years, so the trees talk to each other, and they're like, let's go together, and you get all the trees in an area massed in together. And some years they hold their seeds. And there's various species of acorns, but up here, if you've ever tried one, they're very bitter. If you try to bust one open and eat it, it's those tannins. You can eat it, but it's going to be very bitter and sour. And so you need to leach those acorns. And so the tribes would have various methods, but usually they all involve water. So water flowing through those acorns slowly pulls out their bitterness. And then they can store very well dry as well. And so acorns, pounding acorns, you'd pound them and then cook them in watertight baskets. And you'd be able to make acorn cakes. You'd be able to mix in tarweed with that. And camas, the other major food, which is a tuber. Lewis and Clark Journal is talking about it a lot. But it's a very slow-cooked tuber, which usually from early summer to around this time would be when you're finishing up your camas season. And the other major food or thing you're doing in fall time is hunting. So going out, getting those deer, getting those elk, going to your hunting spots up in the mountains before the snows come. There'd be hunting camps, and you'd be going there and getting your food ready. And fall really is just getting ready for that winter time. Because in winter, most, if not all of our foods aren't really available anymore. So fall time, it's getting those foods that are ready, the abundance of the carbohydrates that are here now, that meat, and then drying it, preparing it. And there'd be various ways. Within our plank houses, there'd be pits or underground storage areas, so putting them in the ground, storing those acorns, or there's pounded cakes. Hazelnuts were another major one. Really good nutrition, so putting it in for the winter time. And then as the weather transitions into winter, it's moving and hoping your family and community's done enough to store food to make it through the winter. As you know, the winters here aren't too harsh. It's not feet of snow, but as I said, the food sources are all gone. And so having those stored foods is really important to have. And as the weather turns, our families would come back to their plank houses, their winter villages, in the more temperate areas close to the water, and they'd work on their materials for the next year. So the carvers and hunters would work on their carvings, they'd work on their hunting tools, getting them ready, mending their nets. They'd make their nets out of stinging nettle. You can take the stalks and break them up and rub them down into cordage. And so that's what a lot of the fishing nets and different net items were made out of. And so wintertime, the families would be coming together. And as Greg mentioned, it's the story season. So the elders would tell our econom, our stories of how things came to be that pass down both the teachings, but also our ethics and morality are encoded within those stories. And so the children are learning that while people are working on their things, getting their food together. And as winter comes through, if there's enough food, that's good. If there's not enough, your villages share together. Like we had village systems and they share food together. But as the winters go on, if it's very tough, there are the survival foods. There are some early tubers. You can eat fern leaves, sword fern roots in wintertime. There are some emergency starvation foods and caches. You can go and raid a squirrel's nest of hazelnuts and grab their hazelnuts if needed. But usually, because it was just so ingrained into the lifeways, there was that good rhythm of getting those foods and making it through the winter time. And then as you come out of the winter time into the springtime, those first shoots come up, those really important plants which are so important because they represent the food being available again. So the strawberry is the first berry that comes back, so watching out for that. The different onions, there's wild onions that come up early in spring. different flowers and greens like miner's lettuce come back, and those foods start to come back. And perhaps the most iconic and important return of the food is the salmon in the area. And so, as you saw mentioned in the video, Greg mentioned first salmon ceremony. And that's what our ancestors did and we continue to do today. Because in our stories, the salmon came and sacrificed itself, their people, to feed our people. And they came and made that relationship and was like, you need us to survive as your food. And so they come back every year up the rivers, to the same rivers, kind of as science has proven, as we knew, they come back to the same rivers they grew up in every year. And we know that's because of the relationship we have. And like any good relationship, it's reciprocal. We honor the salmon. We give thanks in our first salmon ceremony for them coming back to feed us again. So that first fish that's caught every year, we have a ceremony for it and give thanks and ask them to keep coming back year after year. Because our ancestors, those salmon came up so thick, people talk about being able to walk across them. And salmon 7 feet long, 50 pounds or more, just how thick the runs are, because of those relationships and how we work together. And so the fish coming up here in this area, the Willamette River up to the falls, very iconic. A lot of the historical photos, you see the dip netting going on in the falls. But that's not the only way for salmon fishing. As Greg mentioned, a lot of the tribes around here also use spear fishing because the runs would be so thick you could just get your spear and grab them. And the tributary streams, there were also various traps and weirs formed to actually channel and get the fish into the shallows so they can be scooped up by nets and teamworks. And so every spring, that return of the salmon was that huge abundance of protein. And that's why it remains so iconic to the tribes today, and it's so present in a lot of our artwork as we continue forward. Then as spring moves on into summer of the Lifeway season, that's when the berries come, season of the berries. And so the most iconic, with the salmon comes the salmon berries. So those kind of in that relationality, we didn't have calendars, but the salmon berries, if you pay attention, they come up and are ripe around the same time as the salmon are coming back up the river. Following the salmon berries, you start to get some thimbleberries coming on. And then you get the red huckleberries, the lower huckleberries, and then traveling up into the mountains after the snow's melted, the mountain huckleberries. And so that seasonal round, it wasn't only place-based. As that summer comes and the mountains, the snow level goes down, the tribes would travel up to their encampments in the mountains and so have their summer camps up there getting berries and their foods and different items like camas up in the mountains. And so our people would follow the foods. They'd have their permanent plank houses down near the rivers and the low grounds, but through the seasons they'd travel up to the mountains with the foods and then back down again. And so last thing in summertime too, I'm sure Greg mentioned it and it's a top left photo, but it's the skockwil or the Pacific lamprey. It can be very appealing because they've got those lots of teeth like in the Star Wars, the Sarlacc, just all of those teeth. That's their mouth because they're sucker fish. They're suckers, they prey and latch on and suck blood. But similar to salmon, they have a life cycle of going out to the ocean and coming back. So they're born and they grow up in their small stages here in the tributaries and creeks. And the same way, they follow the scents and come back to the same creeks when they're adults that they grew up in. And then they go out to the ocean for a few years and they come back up. And at Willamette Falls around July time as the water gets low, it's once again the most prominent and iconic, but the lampreys climb the falls by sucking onto the rocks and tossing their bodies up. And so the tribes out there, and they continue to this day, if you'll see tribes there around July time taking their boats up to the rocks in the fall, and you go there and you, with your hands, you can reach down in the rapids and the deep pools, and there's just masses of lamprey down there. And a lot of the youth do it now because it's fun. But you have someone holding a hemp or burlap sack and you reach down and grab one and you toss it in the sack and you gather those lamprey. A very iconic food as well. It's one that's actually more impacted by dams because they're not as photogenic as the salmon. A lot of the fish passage dams aren't actually traversable by lamprey. And so that's something the tribe's been working on, is because they need different systems to be able to migrate back up to their spawning grounds. But for cooking the lamprey, as you saw in the video, for our first salmon, traditional salmon, you'd fillet it and cook it over a fire. So good alder wood for smoking flavor. You'd put it on a stick over those coals and cook it. Similarly, the lamprey was cooked over a fire. They do have a cartilage spine, so we would fillet them open to remove that spine because it gets very bitter when you cook it. But then you can either put them back on a stick or have them filleted open and put them over the fire. And the lamprey are really strong medicine for our people. They have a lot of actually omega-3 and fatty acids, a really good oily taste, and they preserve very well. You don't need any seasonings on them. The tribe has in the past held a first fish ceremony just across the river in West Lynn. With COVID, it was put on pause, but hopefully in the future we can continue that, and that one is open to the public. So that's something to look out for. It's usually around May of every year, but it's kind of remembering and honoring those animals that help us survive and continuing on. And so that's kind of just wanted to share about the lifeways a bit. The last two things on there, it's the iconic plank house. This is actually our plank house in Grand Ronde. And this is the traditional permanent living of the Clackamas, Chinookan, and lots of other tribes, where these very large houses with that round opening, there'd usually two fires inside, one cooking fire and one hearth fire. And multiple families would be able to live inside there and store their food and have gatherings and different ceremonies. The top left and the bottom right are examples of our Chinookan art. And so the left is a rock petroglyph. The most iconic and well-known, obviously, is Lillian Pitt's work with Shia watches and the rock art along the Columbia Gorge. And the Clackamas Chinook shares that same art style, the Columbia River art. And so it's got the very pronounced brows, and the ribs are very kind of some of the iconic markers of the Columbia River art. And the top right is one that is salmon designed by Greg Archuleta. And so these lifeways, it's really, day-to-day life was following the seasons, following nature, following that relationship of what's happening, when it's happening, and that's what guided your life. And it was taught to you and reinforced by the economy and by your families and by those you worked with. And so just following this thing year after year, and even to this day, we as a tribe of Grand Ronde seek to keep these lifeways and these seasonal rounds. We'll follow these foods every season and do these same things and continue them in the same way. The next kind of pillar, when I'm thinking of the Clackamas Chinook, in addition to the lifeways, day-to-day life, is place. We're a place-based people. That's what indigenous means to me when I think about it, is being tied to a place, being from a place and having that relationship with a place. And that place is going to affect and shape you. If you look at the southwestern tribes like the Dene, or if you look at the Alaskan tribes like the Tlingit and Haida, their terrain is so much different. And so how they've learned and built their relationship with life and their lifeways, it's very much related to their place. And what works for them there, how they survive, may not work for us here in a different place. And that's not a contradiction, so holding those two things. That's why it's something funny among tribes. Some tribes are like, we don't eat fish. That's taboo, that's wrong. And we're like, we love fish down here. But it's that dissonance which isn't a conflict. In that same way, their place for their reasons and their teachings, fish was not something, maybe because of a story with those fish and what they did, or what type of fish they have there. They don't eat fish. But here we do, and that's not a conflict. So the place people are from is very important. And so there's a small image on the left there. And one disclaimer is our tribes, we aren't like states and governments and cities. We didn't have drawn borders. You'll see on a lot of treaty maps, strict borders to tribes, and that was actually more done by the Indian agents needing to divide up what's now known as Oregon into single chunks and saying one person is able to sign away a treaty for this land. Our tribes, a lot of the tribes in this area, we didn't have that strict central government structures. It was more village by village based. And so with that disclaimer, this is starting to show some of the areas of the Clackamas tribe kind of in relation to where we are today. So you see the Clackamas, they're a Chinookan band, as you've heard, and the Chinooks were the river people, so they were focused more along the rivers, the Willamette and the Columbia. And there's many bands of the Chinook. The Wasco, who are now part of Warm Springs, are Chinookan. The Wotlala, the Cascade Chinookan, the Lower Chinooks, all the way down to the mouth in Astoria. Chinook Nation up in Bay Center, Washington, Long Beach, who are unrecognized, are also Chinookan people. And Chinookan people share a lot of the same ways as river people, shaped by the place of the river and following the river and the fish, being canoe people. Their language of the Chinookan people, they're all somewhat related, but there are various dialects of Chinookan as well. So a Clackamas Chinook may not be able to perfectly dialogue and communicate with a Chinook living up there on the ocean. But there was a trade language even before the Europeans arrived, Chinook Wawa, or Chinook jargon, which was used between tribes to talk and trade and be able to work together. And as the settlers, as the French arrived, as English speakers arrived, that trade language has continued to evolve. And so our word for thank you in Chinook Wawa today is masi, and that's actually from French merci. And so it's, like I said, it's a living language that was here before the traders, but it just continued on as a trade language. As new traders came, the language evolved with them. Vancouver, British Columbia, for a while, their governors actually learned Chinook Wawa as part of their duties and their officials because it went all the way up that far. There was a vast trade network. One of our major currencies in the early era, which is dentalium, which is a long white shell, a mollusk, and so there'd be a creature living in it, was actually gathered from the ocean by divers of other tribes and traded down. And it's all the way out to the plains. You see people with dentalia jewelry. But that was the trade network of the rivers coming through. And it was so common as the main currency. One of the traditional tattoos of the Chinookan people was lines on their forearm. And those lines were for measuring dentalium. So a line this long, they'd be like, oh, a string this long is worth maybe this many salmon. And so place was very important, and that's why the Chinookan people were considered very influential, because they were the river people. Transport along the rivers was much easier and much faster than over land. And so the other major part of the Clackamas Chinook is the mountain, Wakonkin and Clackamas Chinook, what's now known as Mount Hood. So the headwaters of the Clackamas is up there on the southern slope of Mount Hood. And everywhere around the region here, all the photos, even today, seeing Mount Hood, it's a very iconic landscape feature. It's prominent in a lot of our stories and what it means and what it carries. So those two things, the river, the most notably around here, Willamette Falls, as Greg mentioned, Tumwata, as it was called, which roughly translates to waterfalls. And then Wakonkin, Mount Hood. And in a way, those in the rivers, those help shape the seasonal round, traveling up and down. And so next, moving on from place, the next kind of pillar of Clackamas people is the kinship. And what I mean is not only relationships to peoples and each other, But as I mentioned, to the land, and even beyond the land, like I talked about with the fish, the salmon, in our stories, there were ages before there were people, there were the animals. Coyote is very prominent, as among many tribes, with Stankia. The first coyote created a lot of these lands around here, helped create the falls, and then helped find those foods and determine which food and which animal would be what would be good to eat, what would be good to use, and how they'd become and be our relatives and be for the people. And so there's many ages of stories, and as things were made during those creation ages, Coyote went, and some of those animals stayed and remained kind of their descendants as the animals that stayed for us, for our food as people as we are now. And so remembering those relationships to those things. And like I said, those econom, it's not only a story, but it's an ethics and it's a teaching. Like being taught that those animals, these foods, these plants, these trees, this water came and offered themselves to us. They didn't have to, instills a respect for them. Like when we go out and we gather or we're with them, you'll see a lot of, and this is true among many indigenous peoples and tribes as well, we'll honor and give thanks to that. We'll care for them because we know, and as we've seen, like those salmon aren't guaranteed to come back. We've seen just the decline of salmon. We're seeing how things, when they're not tended or cared for, our food patches can be removed and they not come back. And so those stories teach that relationship of these things are gifts, and it's not just like a untouched paradise like our people know of, like these foods just spring up. It was a relationship. The camas bulbs, they actually thrive best in relationship with gathering. If they're left untended, as we see now, going to fields that haven't been gathered, those bulbs will be so closely grown together, they'll be tiny and choking each other out. But actually, regular gathering of the larger bulbs spreads them back out and lets the smaller bulbs grow while we gather the larger bulbs for eating. At the same time, like the oak trees, they get the grubs in them. And so we'd burn every fall or set periods of seasons to remove those grubs, remove those parasites, and remove the buildups. After hunting every year, different people in their camps, they'd burn the land behind them. And we didn't have such catastrophic fires because our tribes traditionally burned these areas. So there was never such a large buildup and laddering of fuels because these lands would be burned and maintained over time. And so in addition to that relationship to land and foods, I wanted to touch a bit like on the kinship structures, on the familiar relationships of the tribes. So as I mentioned, most of the tribes, the Chinookan as well as the Kalapuya, many of the Malalas in this area, there wasn't a central governance. It was more village-based, with a chief usually being the most well-known established and being the wealthiest. But wealth within our concept was being able to provide. If you're the wealthiest, that means you had the most to share. So that if winters were hard or people needed to borrow or use something or a place to stay, the chief would be responsible for being able to provide that and share that out. And that's why he was the chief. It was because he was able to provide for those people. There was a lot of hereditary chiefs as well, and there was a lot of marriages. Our tribes didn't marry within their village. It was sort of taboo, and so tribes were told to marry outside of their villages with other tribes and bands as they travel and trade. And so that not only strengthens the political relationships, it builds those kind of kinship things where people can come together. A lot of these lands, fishing spots, hunting spots, are passed down familiarly. So in that way, there were spots held, but there was so much intermarriage between people throughout villages that those rights to those areas were passed down. So if your mother's family was from the falls and fished on the falls, then you and your children could go back to those falls because you had those fishing rights. And so that's how those things were passed down to these areas. There was also lots of guests. As I mentioned, trade was very important. So those families, when trade delegations would come, they would usually send a runner in advance with a number of sticks on them, carved sticks. And those sticks would represent the number of days before the main trade delegation would come. And so the runner would go, if they're going to get there in 7 days, he'd have the 7 sticks. And each morning, he'd put one away. And so if he got there in 3 days, he'd present 3 sticks. And that way, the chief of the village knew to expect those guests. And so by custom, that chief and those leaders were expected to host those guests with feasts and lodging. And so that's what those relationships were. The guests would come, and from where they came from, they bring what's the food of their area. Like I said, place-based. As you move west into Beaverton and Tualatin, Wapato was a major food source, another tuber. And so if a trade delegation was coming from there, they might have a load of Wapato, and they might be looking for a canoe because the Chinookan's were some of the best canoe carvers. And it wouldn't be, there would be small bartering, but these larger, more formal trades or protocol trades, there wouldn't necessarily be that direct trade of goods. Some people may bring things for bartering, but it's that giving and showing off. Our people showed off by showing how much they had to give away. So if your group was coming to trade, you would get your best and bring it up and present it to your host at those beginning. And the host would thank you, and then they'd ask you, how many days are you planning on staying? And so they would know, this is how many days we have to get our gifts ready to give back to you. And so when those visiting tribes or delegation was ready to go, the host would once again give them a feast and present all those things that they made and gathered for them to send them off. And so in these ways, like our tribes held those kinship systems and worked together. And as you can see, it's a way of distributing and sharing goods, kind of a mutual aid, like before it was a term of sharing those things. And of course, there was also individual trade. I'm not going to say there wasn't. Some people may bring, if they were a good carver, or if they were looking for a new spear, they may bring some of their own items. Gambling was a very popular pastime among our tribes. Stick game continues to this day, but beaver teeth or sticks would be carved with certain symbols. And there's a few different types of games, but a very popular pastime was playing stick game and gambling for goods and fun. And then that's some of the social stuff. And then once again, too, I do want to acknowledge, too, like our people in this area in Chinookans, they did practice head flattening, as you've heard about, which was when babies, they would actually, as you can see from Paul Kane's photo on the right, that person's head has been flattened, like you can see it curved back. And that was actually something among the Chinookans that was done as high status, like the high status children had their heads flattened. Which being in a cradle board, there would be stones or boards tied and then retightened to flatten that head. And one people whose heads were never flattened was that there was some slaves and forms of slavery among the tribes. There was raiding and trading of slaves. And so I do want to acknowledge, like, there was that going on within our tribes as well. A lot of raiding parties and taking captured slaves and then using them for domestic labor. And then, so I mentioned there's the head flattening on the left is one of the village chiefs of the Lameth. And then there in the center is another Paul Kane drawing of a plank house. And then the last portion of kinship I did want to talk about is in relation to people, it's also the spiritual. In addition to the econom, we had our ceremonies. which also served as another pillar of helping us define not only who we were and our purpose, but how that purpose could link us into each other. Among many of our tribes here, it's the term Tamanoas. And that's kind of like, it's hard to translate, but the idea of spirit power or helper or gift. And so as coming of age, all youth would go out there and go out to those sacred spots and look to see if they'd have a Tamanoas. So they'd go out there by themselves through days and nights and stay up and fast and go to those special places and call out and see maybe a Tamanoas would come to them. Some people might not get anything. Some might have something come to them. It might be grizzly. It might be heron. Heron being a fisher, if that came to you, you would be a good fisher. You'd be like, oh, I must be a fisher. Grizzly was also a fisher, but it also the bears search and find the medicines. So you might also be a medicine person. Some people had multiple different beings in Tamanoas come to them, and those might be the medicine people who come and work with people. And so when they come back, and maybe they have something come to them, or maybe they don't, and they finish and they come back. But that coming of age, it signifies the point of a young person's life when they're ready to see how they fit in and how they work, just not only as themselves and as an individual, but they're in their community. They may have found, like I said, heron, and then they'll be told, you're going to be a fisher person, you're going to fish for your people and community. They may have seen beaver, who's a carver, because they carve those trees, and they might become a canoe carver. Spider, a weaver, they might become a good weaver. And so a lot of these things helped solidify and create the roles and are passed down for how our communities work together. The other major tenet continued was the winter dances. So in Plank House, in every winter, we would have ceremonies in the winter dances of kind of reinforcing and remembering and honoring those spirits and things. So those would go through the nights within the plank houses, and people would have their own songs and their own instruments and regalia and dances, kind of reinvigorating and remembering those things. The other kind of well-known spiritual thing of this area is what's now known as the Willamette meteorite, which was the tribes had come to it and they knew it was a meteorite and they called it Tamanoas itself. And they came and it was very sacred. And then some new landowners came in the Clackamas area and they came upon it, and then they decided, oh, this is ours, and it was actually sold and removed to the Natural History Museum in New York eventually. The tribe actually sued and tried to litigate to stop that, but it was denied. But since then, relationships have been built, and the tribe actually has a delegation every year go up to the Natural History Museum and youth intern and learn about the history of it. And our different leaders and elders are able to go out there and visit Tamanoas every year. And so that's kind of the three pillars I wanted to really talk about. And there's a million tangents I could have gone on, but just to try to talk to you about some of the life ways of the Clackamas people and who they are and how we lived in relation to the land. And the other key thing which I really wanted to bring and reinforce today is that it's a continued relationship and life ways. As I mentioned, the Clackamas Chinook, in addition to over 20 other bands and tribes, were all taken or removed, and we're now known as Grand Ronde. And as I mentioned, because of intermarriages, there are Clackamas Chinook who are enrolled in Siletz, and Warm Springs, and Yakima, and Cowlitz. All of our tribes and people are related by marriages, and nowadays we have to identify as one. But most of the tribal people from this area, if we talk about families long enough, we'll find out we're all related. And so I wanted to bring in that idea. And very interesting about, you mentioned your exhibit, Craig, because this is Ankati Piuksan. And Ankati is like way back then, is kind of the idea, like the way old ages. And Uksan is today. So I wanted to title it Then and Now, essentially, kind of looking at life back as our ancestors would see it in those lands, and then looking at today, that continuance. And so this is one of the well-known drawings, I believe it's of Paul Kane, of at the falls, of the tribes up there. And just striking, we're all very close now, and I'm sure you've been around the falls in Blue Heron, you kind of know what it looks like now. That same view almost from the bridge or down at the boat landing. And just seeing how the trees look there and everything, and the people. And then I wanted to share the now, the recent photo, almost that same kind of perspective. This is from that Blue Heron site. So as you can see, interestingly, it's almost that exact same view of seeing the land there. And things are different. Like there's the old mill buildings, but you can see like the land's still there. It's very much there. The falls are still there. And that's Greg Archuleta who made the video, Clackamas Chinook. And so our people still being there on the lands. And that being like a really important thing I like to bring up is that idea of it being gone or past. Not only the people, but the land and the life ways of it being like, oh, that's gone now. Those ways are different. It's not there anymore. But fighting that erasure and visibility as a tribe is something I think is really important, is that not only for us as people, but also the land, like that looks to me very similar. It's still there, and the fish still come up there every year. The next one, same place on the falls, it's dip netting on the falls. So I'm sure if you aren't familiar, the salmon would run up so thick and there'd be certain passages which were easier to travel up. And so families and groups, they would have their spot. Like that might be a family spot right there where they dip net from and build their platform. And you just go out there with a net and you just scoop up the salmon. Even to this day, our tribe still dip nets. Other tribes, if you travel up the Columbia River, up the gorge, up near Bonneville, you see lots of tribes still dip netting, and they still are family spots. Like, if you're from that family or a family invites you, we still have the same protocols. If you can be invited to go there, but spots belong to certain families. And so, same thing, almost the same perspective. Here's recently our tribal members up there at Willamette Falls with their scaffold dip netting. And we go up the falls and we're allowed as a tribe only 5 fish each year to dip net in this way from the falls. And we use these fish for our first fish ceremony around May time. So every year that same continuance of those same ways, like remembering. And I haven't had the opportunity because understandably for safety, you need certain training. But our members who have gone up there say it's a very just amazing experience to go up there on the falls and see the salmon, be able to fish in that way. Next up is another painting of the interior of a Chinookan plank house. And there's some markers. If you see kind of in the center, there's that image carved there in the main beam, and that's the Chinookan art style I mentioned, the Columbia River, where it's got the pronounced brows, the pronounced nose, and then there's some ovaline eyes. And then you've got the sleeping quarters, you've got the hearth fire here in the back of the plank house. And then here, this is our plank house over in Grand Ronde. So you can see we've got the changing and sleeping quarters in the back. We have our fire there in the front, and we have our people there gathered, and this plank house was made from cedar. We still use it for gatherings and ceremonies and celebrations to this day. Next up, this was a painting done of 4 clackamas, 4 men found at the mouth of the Clackamas River playing stick game, gambling together. It's a very iconic image of Clackamas people. If you look up Clackamas, you'll see these 4 of Clackamas. I wanted to pair that with 4 of our tribal members here. One of them in the back there, she is Clackamas Chinook descendant, and then our councilman there, John George. And our people still being here and coming back, that's a replica of Tamanawas, the meteorite. So that's the same, what it looks like, but recreated in a smaller replica. And so that same image of our people kind of still being there together in these ways, in these life ways. And so just wanted to kind of bring that down as a roundabout of the presentation part of the slideshow. Oops, and then I'll go back briefly, and I'm going to move over to the demonstration part. So this sounding good? Okay, perfect. I'm going to start, I think I'll start with the river. So this was carved from red cedar, which to this day continues to be carved, but was the major carving wood for our peoples. Because it gets a very fine grain, you need it 300 years or older to really have the grain you need for carving detail. There's a very prominent contemporary carver named Greg Robinson. If you ever look up his work, he has incredibly detailed carvings in Chinookan style. And he's Lower Chinook of Chinook Nation, but he works a lot with our tribe. But this is the style of the Chinookan canoe. So it has the figure on the mast. Each canoe would have a figure carved by the canoe maker. This one hasn't been detailed in, but traditionally they would be. That maker would have a certain figure they would use there for the canoe. And then the shape of the prow, and then the shape of the tail, kind of unique to Chinookan canoes. There's a couple types. There's an ocean type, which is a little steeper so the rocking and the waves can stay more upright. And then there would be river canoes, which are a little flatter for traversing faster and shallower waters. Going alongside the canoes, this is actually a Chinookan style paddle. So each tribe also had their own specific shape of paddles. So the Chinookans kind of had this little half-moon crescent at the top. And when the tribes would go in and land or store their canoes or paddles, they would place their paddles upright in their canoes. And so if you could see them from far away, you'd be able to look and see and know which people those were in that canoe. And so this is another Chinookan paddle. This one's actually a rattle. So we use a lot in our canoe journeys, which a lot of tribes in this area participate in. We have songs with the hand drum and the rattle. And so this one Greg uses and takes the canoe journey, but this is one example of a rattle. Traditionally, we'd also have rattles made out of deer hooves or shells. Next up, kind of continuing along the river culture, this is actually the beginning of a fish trap, even as traditionally would be made. So if you can see it, this is made from willow, but you have the opening here, which the fish would come in, and you'd have a larger basket or container around the outside. So once fish came in, you've got pointed ends down here and narrows, and so fish actually can't get back out. So it wasn't only dip netting, fish traps, but as well as nets. So sometimes a couple canoes would go out to a good fish run, and they'd string a net between them with weights along the bottom and just be able to paddle around and gather up the fish that way. They'd also be able to make, on side channels, if you stack the rocks, you can make traps. So they'd swim into and rest, and then you can come around them with a net too and spear them or gather them easily. Next up is a small carving of a lamprey. I think it's really interesting. It doesn't have the really graphic teeth there in it, but it does have the shape, and it has the 7 holes on it, which represent the 7 gills. So every lamprey has the 7 holes. In some tribes, 7 is an important number among their tribes, and the lamprey having those 7 gill holes holds significance for them as well. Moving next, in addition to the wood of the cedar, the bark of the cedar is actually another very important plant resource for the tribes then and now. Most notably, it's used for basketry. So this is made out of cedar bark being plaited together. Also, a lot of the hats you'll see, those cedar bark hats, those are made of cedar bark as well. And so the process, this is the inner bark of cedar. So the outer bark, if you're familiar with the tree, it's kind of more papery, scaly. And in springtime, once the sap finishes, before the sap runs up or finishes, is the ideal time. And you'll go find a tree without any branches on it, a nice wide strip, and you'll cut the bottom and you'll pull that strip off, that tree, and you'll get a very long strip for weaving with. So you can see, and why this one's a demo one is we were a little late, so the sap, once it's running up the trunk, it actually sticks. So you can see the dried sap here, and actually makes it really hard to work with. But once you've pulled it, you actually take this, you shave off the outside bark, so you only have this inner section, and then you have to let it dry and cure for a whole year to let all the moisture out. After a year, you take your piece or roll of bark like this, and it's really hard now, but if you soak it in water for 5 to 15 minutes, it actually softens up and becomes very pliable. So after that stage, we actually break it down into strips like this. So we'll break down both the thickness and the length into strips like this, and then this is like the next stage. And using strips like this is what you use to make a basket. So there's actually several steps to actually going into a cedar basket over a year's process and work and preparation. So as I mentioned, kind of during that winter time, those type of things, those processings, like there's a whole lot of things that go in and can be done during the winter between processing and weaving. And then the next I wanted to show you was that this is actually ash bark from the ash tree. It's very riparian, water-loving, so you'll find it in very wet areas along creeks and streams. And ash barks, we actually still did and continue to use them a lot for buckets. And so we'd actually take the whole tree down and peel off the bark. So this is a single piece from a branch. So you'd get your log and carefully cut down one end and try to peel off the piece in a single piece. Because then, once you soak it, this is actually a bucket made from a single piece of ash bark. And so it was taken like this and just folded up, and then used willow here, the inner bark of willow, to make quick buckets. So not only ash bark, but cedar bark as well in the same way. If you pulled it, you can fold it up and bind the edges and make a quick bucket out of it. This is also made from ash bark, and this is a cooking tray. So same thing, it's a single long piece, and then the edges are cut and folded up and rounded around. And this type of cooking tray would actually be used for the tarweed, the similar sunflower seeds. So after you gathered all your seeds, you'd cook a couple of volcanic rocks in the fire, get them nice and hot, and put them in the bucket. And this one's a little large, but then you just kind of shake and winnow it, and it would toast those seeds within there. And you toss it, because there's little chaff catches in the wind and flies off. And so trays like this, along with the hot rocks, were used to cook. And so yeah, that's just a few demos, and then I wanted to leave time open for any questions. Yeah, the question was whether Kalapuyan or Chinookan chiefs would have more than one wife. Traditionally in the past, yes, they often would. Many different chiefs or wealthy people did have multiple wives. So the role of horses in the Willamette Valley, they weren't as prominent as to the east of the high desert. There was some horse use, but just due to the terrain and the river travel, I don't believe we kind of use as much as our neighbors like the Umatilla and Cayuse.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, so the question was about the clothing. Clothing there'd be various. So a lot of the women would have maple bark or cedar bark skirts. And so if you take cedar bark like this and you pound it, it gets more fibrous, almost kind of like a raffia, and then you can make a skirt out of it. And then some clothing was also made out of different leather, and then the winter clothing, other furs. Most of the tribes in this area were actually the patrilineals, so the wife would come to the husband's family, but the wife would kind of be the intermediary. She would know the language where she came from, and so she'd be able to go back there on the visits and kind of bring that relationship.
Something about the fishing.
Yeah, that's a good question. Sources of a chief's wealth. Sometimes and often it was familial, so there were families where, just like it is today, a family may have had a lot, they may have a good plank house, that family may have had the best spot on the river for fishing, and so they obviously have the most fish. But there are stories of chiefs who were kind of wasteful or lazy, even if they got it from their family and they didn't do anything. But there are people, so maybe someone got a Tomanowos and maybe they became a very good carver, or they were a very good hunter, and so then they became wealthy through that of their different skills and gifts. So there's both a combination of inheritance, but also people's like skills and gifts. Yeah, the question was about Milwaukee present day and tribal villages, and honestly, I wouldn't be the best person to know. We have archaeologists and then our historian David Lewis, because like I mentioned, we'd have to pretty much go and see what the closest village was, because there may not even have been a village here, and it may have been, I'm curious of what it might have looked like if this was Oak Savannah 300, 400 years ago. Oak Grove, yeah. So that's where I'd start, is looking back and either the old historical records or archaeologists of what the nearest village was, and then maybe starting from there. You had one first.
Can you say anything about the burial traditions or the dead, how the people...
Yeah, burial traditions. Once again, it would vary a bit from place to place. So some of the Chinookan peoples, they would place, especially those families or prominent people, they would place them in a canoe with their belongings. Or they may place them in a place near the river, like Minto Island in Salem is well known, because it would flood seasonally. The dead were actually placed there and taken away by the river. And so there'd often be different spots in different places, but often left with their belongings in certain spots. Yeah, so for teaching and education, kind of as I mentioned, it was a constant process. Those stories are econom, which from one end can be viewed as myth, but they can also be viewed as teaching. Like they're stories of Flint Boy, of a child being naughty and not being helpful. So in the story, he's left alone and cast out for the village. Like that's a teaching, if you think about it as a kid. If you're selfish and mean, you might not have people who want to take care of you. And so a lot of our stories, there were the creatures, the scary stories. There was a basket ogress, a big giant with a basket on her back. And if kids were out by themselves playing in the woods, the ogres would come and take them away. And so teaching kids to be mindful. And then, so those ethics and morals and that thankfulness, that remembering who your people are and like why we give thanks, participating in these ceremonies and honoring these fish, start to build those ethics and living your life in the life ways, traveling around, knowing which foods come at certain times. And then once as you grow up, as I mentioned with the Tamanawas, that coming of age, that's when you either directly are given kind of here's what you're going to do or here's where you're going to be, or even if not, that's when you might start working with the adults and you might start having to go hunt and do tasks and kind of do things. And so how that could translate, I mean, it's tough. I mean, the easiest thing I think of is just the idea of mentorship is just, that's how I came to in my job today. Greg Archuleta, I was a college student, and I hadn't lived in the area, but coming back and reconnecting with the tribe, I'd travel with him and see him give talks like this, see him do demonstrations, go out, gather food, work with him and learn how to do these things. So that same way, I think, of just passing things on and being open to teaching someone who's interested.
Thank you.
You had a question?
I'm just curious during the seasonal migration when they would come down from the mountain, like would they all come together at once or would it be broken up in groups? How did they accomplish that?
Yeah, I don't believe it was a huge group. I know some people, it wouldn't even be the whole tribe or village. Some people would remain behind maybe, and they'd have their jobs and tasks down here around the river and lowlands because there'd be different foods and things to mend. But the hunters of the hunting families would travel up there, and the berry gathering. Also elevationally things kind of move, so you'd have camas and berries ready here earlier, and then once they're done, you can move up to the mountain and get them again up there. And so there'd be certain waves and groups you probably go together. Yes.
You say you work with the tribes as well as the general public. What kind of work do you do with the tribes? Is it the same demonstration, or do you go a little bit deeper, or is it higher culture?
For the tribes, it's more, because as Greg mentioned, our tribe was terminated by the government in 1954, which the government was essentially like, you've assimilated enough, you don't need to be seen as a tribe. It's hurting you, just become Americans. And the tribe resisted that, and a lot of people worked together. And it wasn't only our tribe, Siletz was also terminated, Klamath as well. Worked together to be restored, but that took 30 years, and that was recent, that was in the 80s for restoration. So a lot of our adults didn't grow up with the culture, especially if they were born or their parents were in termination. So they scattered out. So it's a mix. The biggest thing for our members is just welcoming them back in. There's no shame in not being connected. My parents weren't connected to the culture. Greg welcomed me back in. And taking us out and showing and doing these things and taking away any mysticism, this is our life. We go out and we gather cedar bark and we weave and we gather berries. And really just practicing, not just talking about the life ways, but creating opportunities to practice them for our members is what we try to do a lot, and learn from them too, because their families may hold things that we don't hold anymore too. Yeah.
The spiritual, the coming of age process, did girls do that also?
Yeah, tribe to tribe. So some tribes, it was only young men. Some was both. But also among most tribes, women had a first menses coming of age. So there was a lot of traditions and protocols around a woman coming into her time as well of. But for Tamanoas, yeah, there was both. Some tribes had both men and women, and yeah.
And I have a second question. Good. Now, is there an effort to teach language to young tribal people?
Yeah, an effort to teach the language. So as I mentioned, because Grand Ronde has so many mother languages, the tribe itself has adopted Chinookwawa as Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde's language. And so we actually have language classes that go on. There's actually a preschool immersion on the reservation where kids fully learn in Chinookwawa and teachers. And there's language classes here in Portland, back in Grand Ronde. And I believe even Chemeketa Community College has offered as a language program. I think I saw you first.
I've heard that a lot of places around the Portland area have indigenous names, Multnomah, Clackamas, etc. Now I've heard the name Milwaukee is indigenous, means land by many waters or something like that. Is that correct?
Whether the name Milwaukee, its indigenous meaning, I don't believe Milwaukee was named from a local language. I believe it might have been named after the Milwaukee out east, but that does have an indigenous meaning in their language over there, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Yes.
You were talking about teaching current tribe members local lifeways. Do you have like camas fields that you're going to harvest and learning how to cook them, or how widespread is it?
Yeah, whether we have local camas fields and practices, there are, so Metro has a few properties with camas on them, and they've worked with our tribe as well as other Native community to actually protect, grow, and test for toxins. And so there's properties around there where even this year, the local Native community of intertribal went there and gathered and baked camas. Our tribe also works with Siletz in one of our joint areas on the Saniam River with the Forest Service, a camas field, where we've taken members out there to gather camas. And we're actually hoping to do another camas bake next June with the tribe as well. So, but the toughest thing is obviously locationally. We're here in Portland. Grand Ronde's kind of southwest towards the coast, but our people's tribes stretch all the way down to the California border. Like we have people to Kelma who are moved to Grand Ronde. And so that's something our tribe's been trying to look at, is because all of our government resources and staff are up here, but how do we keep that relationship with not only our members down there, but the land down there when it's a 5-hour drive away? So that's something we've been, which interestingly, our tribe, along with Siletz, we're holding an acorn camp for our tribal members down in Medford this weekend. So we do what we can. Yes.
Kathleen on Zoom has another question. What important roles did women play?
Women within the tribes, they basically were the reason we could survive, essentially. I mean, and one big thing which always has to be taken with a grain of salt is a lot of the ethnographies, a lot of the stuff we have mentioned of specific tribes and customs, the ethnographers were men, and coming from a European standpoint, so quite often they were focused more on the male tasks, male's position of powers, didn't speak to women as much or disregarded them. And then, as well as maybe having a fixation on more gendered roles. But with that in mind, a lot of what we have is the women were responsible for a lot of the food, preparing the food, knowing how to get them the berries, fix the meat. The weaving was traditionally among more female-identified members, which we did have different, the terms two-spirit tribal members. So even if someone was born a man, they can identify as a woman and take on women's roles. And they also often had special roles within the tribes. But the weaving within kind of a gender terms was more within that feminine side, carving and hunting, masculine, food preparation, feminine. And I believe that's some of the majors, and then each tribe may have had some different nuances. Yes.
I just wanted to say thank you again. I enjoyed this a lot, so how can I get more of you, more education? Where's the place to find more lectures, more in-person events?
Yeah, the best place to find more info or lectures are in person. If you can travel, the tribe has a museum open to the public, the Chalu Museum, open Tuesday through Saturday. We have some fixed displays and rotating displays. They have a Facebook too, where there are some events and talks hosted out there at the tribe. The tribe holds annual history and culture summits, which are open to the public. I think they happen around fall time-ish every year, so that's something to look out for. And then locally, specifically the tribe has a few events, like I mentioned, First Salmon in May, here near the river. And then there are some speakers, like David Lewis over at OSU gives a lot of talks. But there's also a vibrant intertribal community here in Portland. And so there's salmon bakes, where I believe there's a couple coming up this month, one in Westmoreland and one in Oxbow, with different tribal communities from these areas kind of sharing, and those are usually open to the public. And then Tryon Creek State Park, their Friends of Tryon Creek Executive Director, Gabe Shioships, he's Cayuse and a Umatilla tribal member, and he tries to integrate a lot of Native American teachings and events into their programs there. Yes.
What's the view of the tribal members of the role of casinos in your future?
Yeah, the view of tribal members on casinos. I suppose I can only speak of myself as one tribal member, so definitely not for all of them. And I do know it's varied. There's a spectrum, just like with everything. Some embrace it, some oppose it. And what I can say is that when we were terminated, a lot of what had been our reservation lands was really abundant timberlands, and that was all removed and taken away. And all the tribe was left with was a cemetery, less than 5 acres. And so that's all the tribe held. And 30 years later, we were restored and we had a bit more land given, but all of these abundant lands, access to the salmon, the fish, the acorn fields, everything, was taken away and never restored. And our people having to find and come together again after being scattered for 30 years, and being able to use the law and politics to be able to form a casino. The revenues from the casino are why we're able to come here and bring our members back and have programs and teach our culture again and provide assistance to our members, kind of as was promised in the treaties, was with those revenues. And so it's been a positive in being able to provide those support and systems for our members. But it's obviously not without its ills, and there is a need for other different ventures as well. Yes.
What were some of the recreational activities available to children, and have any of those activities survived to present day?
Yeah, children's recreational activities. There were lots of games of skills. So one from the top of my head was an archery game. So you'd make a hoop out of willow or a branch, and a kid would roll it on the ground, and the other kids would try to shoot an arrow and get it through that hoop. So practicing that skill. That's the major game that comes to mind. And then obviously stick games and gambling, which kids wouldn't have as much to gamble, but they'd still be able to play. And that's something even now in there's a Title VI program, as it's called in schools, Indian education, where a lot of them do stick games, where it is kind of a guessing game, one of them, where children are able to hide a stick in a hand and try to guess which hand it's in with each other. So off the top of my head, those are the children's games I could think of. Back there.
You talked about the 300-year-old red cedar, I think you said. So would that be the wood used for a larger boat?
Yeah.
And so that would be part one. And then how did people determine the age of the cedar to know that it was ready to be carved?
Yeah, asking about 300-year-old red cedars for carving canoes, and then being able to determine the age of the cedar. I'd say 300 is just like a rough number. It's more size-based. So if you've seen an old-growth cedar, you know what that looks like. And so canoes are traditionally carved from a single log and carved on the spots. You'd need to find a trunk wide enough for a canoe to carve and bring it down on the spot. And then smaller ones just for other carving, it's in the grain. So once you get into it a little bit, you want a really tight, fine grain. If you're familiar with wood, you can, fir's the easiest. It's so fast growing. If you look at the grain, each ring is so wide. But 300 years old, it's almost paper thin or hair thin. And that's what you really want to see for good carving and detail. And it's hard to find those nowadays.
There's one last question on Zoom from Heather. Asks you to mention the efforts of the Chinook to regain their federal status, realizing that they're separate from the Confederated tribes of the Grand Ronde.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Chinook Nation was recognized by the state, and I believe even former President George Bush back in the 2000s, but it failed to actually make it to that state of federal recognition. And then so in a sense, they were betrayed. They were told they would be recognized, and they weren't. And so they're being state recognized, but federal recognition carries with it those rights, those treaty rights and special status that to be able to access a lot of the resources which are owed to them by treaty, and that they're based out of Washington, but Grand Ronde is a strong supporter of the Chinook Nation and seeking their recognition on the federal level. So that's something, I know there's a lot of demonstrations and stuff held up in Seattle, and then Chinook Nation's based out of Bay Center up on Long Beach, Washington. They have, I believe, a website and had some land actually acquired recently, but Chinook Nation, like I said, they're our relatives, and if you ever see an opportunity to support their recognition, Grand Ronde's a strong supporter of them.
I'm not the only one that doesn't want this to end, but the library director said that he was going to beat me up if we didn't get out of here by 8 o'clock. So time for one more question, if anybody has one.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to some of the traditions around marriage.
Yeah, some of the traditions around marriage. As I mentioned, the women usually came to live with the husband's family, but there was also gifts given, kind of like with everything, where the husband's family, the wife's family would come and bring stuff, but then the husband's family would also offer things to the wife's family. And I think a lot of ethnographers call it dowry, but the sense of it was more of like that family was losing someone who contributed and helped their family prepare foods and do things, and they were essentially losing that family member. So to make up for that, the husband's family would have to gift the wife's family, like, here's what we give you, and like, thanks for like, you're giving us all this labor, but I'll show those relations and lineage. And so there'd be kind of that presentation of gifts and feasts. And then certain tribes would have varying specific wedding ceremonies, but I believe the core was that major, is that coming together and exchanging of gifts.
So Chris, thank you very much for being here. A big round of applause. Counselor Adam Khosrowbadi knows what it means to serve. As a combat veteran, he served overseas in Iraq and continues to serve his community as a football coach, notary public, and small business owner. Counselor Khosrowbadi was appointed to council in 2021 and is chair of the Clackamas County Veterans Advisory Council. He previously served as a planning commissioner and on the Public Safety Advisory Committee as the Linwood NDA rep. Now, I want to tell you a story about Adam. It was May 24th during one of our planning commission meetings. We were on a 10-minute break. So Adam, myself, and another planning commissioner, we all went outside to catch some fresh air. In the doorway at the City Hall entrance was a person sleeping, blocking one of the doors. We've all been in that situation. The other commissioner and I had an annoyed look on our face because the entrance was blocked. We all went outside, enjoyed the non-rainy weather, went to return inside the building. The person sleeping woke up, started to rant about being hit by a truck, and started to show his scars. The other commissioner and I quickly booked into the building. But Adam stopped, knelt down to the person, and asked him if he was okay. He wanted to make sure that that person, if he needed help, he could give it to him. Adam did this without hesitation or thought and wanted to make sure the person was supported, recognized, and being cared for. Now, Adam and I may not share the same views on how to accomplish the concerns we face in Milwaukee today, or even see eye to eye on what major concerns are, but his character, when no one is watching, certainly proves not only does he mean what he says and stands for, but is willing to do the work and carries the compassion to get it done. Please welcome Counselor Khosrowbadi.
Hello, thank you everyone, and thank you Greg for that tremendous introduction. I'm a little bashful. That story actually, thank you for everybody who's here, and thank you for everyone who sponsored this event and who continues to sponsor the event. The history that you bring is one of the reasons what we're talking about, why we're here and we're talking today, right, is to not forget about the past regardless of what it looks like. And diversity and what that brings. And the story he talks about, I think, speaks to that, because if the better we understand what people have been through or have experienced those experiences ourselves, the better off we'll be not only as a community, but as counselors to make better decisions and better policies that not only deal with equality, but also, most importantly, equity. And I think that's what really comes down to these stories, right, about these diverse people. Me, I'm Iranian, Italian. My father and my Iranian family immigrated here during the Iranian Revolution. I am Muslim. I am married to a proud Peruvian woman who's Latina. We just had our firstborn child, who is a biracial child. And this is part of the reason why I do what I do, and part of the reason why telling these stories are so important. To know the struggles and hear the struggles and the tribulations and the perseverance of different groups of people, again, not only interweaves in our community fabric, but also makes us grow as human beings to be better individuals. And that's something that I think we need to do more of, right? Especially these last few years. What better way to do that than to get to know your neighbor and get to know where they come from and the history about the people that live in our very own city. You know, Milwaukee is unique because we have such a broad group of individuals here that bring something different to the table. And one thing about diversity that you can't argue about is no matter who it is that you talk to, anytime you talk to somebody with a diverse background or a diverse history or a diverse story to tell, you will always walk away learning something. You'll always walk away learning something that you didn't learn before, no matter the circumstances. And that's something very important as well, especially in a time where a lot of our education is coming from social media. Unfortunately, nobody's talking to each other anymore. And again, that brings in the diverse part. We as elected officials, it's important for us, again, for the decision-making process. We've been victims too often on policies that have only catered to one side or the other, correct? I mean, we can all agree with that. The lack of talking to each other, communicating, and understanding where we all come from and what barriers we have faced in our lives is what creates those inequities. So that's why these stories are so important. That's why the History Museum is so important, because if you don't know anybody who comes from a diverse background, that's hard to believe nowadays, right? Everybody's from somewhere. Then that's what the museum is here for. That's what individuals like Greg who dedicate their time are here for, is to make sure that that stuff is not forgotten about, that we learn from the past so that we create a better future for everyone. Just like with the tribes of the Grand Ronde, listening and hearing from this group of people who have suffered tremendously and continue to suffer. And Native Americans have continuously suffered throughout the history of our country, and it's every day new history is made for them in suffering. And being able to be elected officials and hearing these stories, again, results in better equity, better equality, better resources for these individuals to feel like they're on par and on the same page and are afforded at least the same opportunity that everyone else in this room is. So thank you so much. I really appreciate what you do for the city, what you do for the museum, and you all being here. Diversity and these stories are important. I don't know how much time I was given, about roughly 5 minutes. I don't want to take too much time because I would love to hear from the tribes of the Grand Ronde, because I myself would like to hear more about, aside from just the land acknowledgements, what other things can we do as elected officials to make sure that you feel that you guys are being heard, that you all have a voice at the table and a seat at the table. And hearing their stories of diversity, is one step towards that goal. So thank you again for being here, and this shows that you all are interested and are on the same page when it comes to that diversity. And hopefully this continues and there's more questions to be asked and more people who want to learn. I appreciate it, and again, I look forward to your discussion. Thank you all, and thank you, Greg, for having me.